process. We don't know what day of the week that they started on, but there is a prohibition from working on the Sabbath. If they started on the first day of the week and then marched once per day and went around 7 times on the seventh day, they marched 7 times and attacked the city on the Sabbath. So there's an oddity in the way that God goes about this. And again, everything we've seen so far says that when God wants to do something big, he does it in a way that's odd, at least by our calculations, in a way that would be odd. And so it may very well be that this was a Sabbath occurrence when he sent them into the battle, or it may have been on another day that they just walked one time around on the Sabbath. But that information is not given to us. They're to yell only at the time that Joshua tells them to yell. Again, the same commentator says if you're in an army that is marching around the perimeter and you're that far apart and there's a city in between, Joshua must have made advance notice of exactly what they were going to do. They knew everything on the last day and how it was going to unfold and what was going to happen when they got there. He also suggested, again, if you've got that many people, where do you put them? You may have ended up in the 7 times around actually adding groups of people that, like we used to do wind the clock, and you just, more and more people were coming out of camp and surrounding them. Can you imagine what the feeling was inside of Jericho when the entire army, you had seen them go by in a small procession, we don't know how many abreast, but, in a smaller collection. But what if the whole bunch of them is marching around the perimeter of your town? And so they yelled, and the city fell down in front of them. The walls just collapsed. Some of what they have found on the walls was that it was a stonework wall up to a certain level, and then the tops of the walls were a veneered over brickwork. So suggestions have been made as far as how much vibration was being set up by 500,000 people walking in circles around you. And then, of course, the answer to that is, why does God need your help to knock down the walls of Jericho? When it was time for the walls to come down, they came down. And then the difficult part, they went in, each man in front of him. So everybody, they've got the place surrounded, and they just met in the middle when the walls came down. Destroyed everybody, all the animals, all the living things, and took the precious metals for the tabernacle. So everything that wasn't destroyed was dedicated, and they were to take all the dedicated things back as a gift to God for this first battle and this first victory that they've won. And again, one of the commentators said it's a little bit like first fruits, right? When you had a firstborn child, your firstborn son, you had to redeem him, right? If you had a firstborn animal, you sacrificed them. So this is the first fruits. This is the first incursion into Canaan. And when you win, you bring back the gifts and give them to God. They don't belong to you. And again, next week, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But people have problems with the idea of the total destruction of human and animal life within Jericho. For a long time, you only had to worry about people that didn't like that God said, go kill all the people, and then PETA showed up, and now you have to worry about whether, we killed all the animals too. But there's a difficult vein of Scripture all through the Old Testament, and I wanted us to take a quick look tonight at some of the ones we've already seen, and they're just going to stack up. Okay, Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve sin in the garden, what's the penalty? It's death, right? They're removed from the tree of life. So as severe a penalty as you could possibly imagine. God didn't slap them on the wrist. He didn't just take them out of the garden, but give them access to the tree of life. Took them out of the garden, guarded the way to the tree of life, and said, because of your sin, you'll die. And not just you, but all of those who live on the planet who are born after the similitude of Adam, as Paul would say. You get to Genesis 6, and you have the flood, but this is the first example of one that's being saved. There's an element of grace. Right? So we have tremendous carnage in that God destroys all of the life on the planet except for Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their wives, and the animals that Noah had brought together. And so that famous passage in Genesis 6 that says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So in some of these instances, there's great carnage, but at the same time, there's great grace. In Genesis 11, mankind is getting too far too fast. They're building the big monument to themselves, building a big city in the plains of Shinar. And God comes down and confuses their languages and separates them out to keep them from being too self-sufficient. Genesis 19, you have Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, so not just the 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, but the cities of the plain. All that area is destroyed with fire and brimstone. Again, great carnage, but we have some folks who find grace, right? Lot and his wife and their daughters exit the city. Lot's wife turns back and does not make the escape, but Lot and his 2 daughters are saved from all that carnage because God loved Abraham and gave Lot grace on Abraham's behalf. You get to Exodus chapter 5, and you've got the plagues of Egypt, right? Tons and tons of horrible things happening to a country, and then finally on Passover night, the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt. Who finds grace? Israel does, right? Israel is saved because of the carnage that comes to the other people, and Israel is able to exit and go into the promised land. Eventually, when they get there, you have lots of carnage because God is taking from the Canaanites and giving to the Israelites. There's not a tremendous explanation other than God is sovereign and God can do whatever he wants to with his creation. There are some who are dying that just deserve to die. The culture of Canaan was depraved in a lot of ways, and so we could say, well, God is cleaning out the riffraff before he brings in his holy people. Unfortunately, his holy people don't follow through, and they end up being the riffraff after a while. 586 BC, God sends the Babylonians in. They wipe out Israeli culture and take them all into captivity. The northern 10 tribes get wiped out and assimilated by Assyria about 100 years before that. So God does a lot of this, taking from this group and giving to that group and punishing this group with that group, all through the Old Testament. There's a lot of destructive judgments that God brings on the people. You'll run into two kinds of people, maybe 3, but I'm going to go with 2. You've got people that cannot deal with that, and so they accuse God of unholiness because he does something that doesn't seem right to them. My question to that group of people is, where did you get your concept of what's holy? If you didn't get your concept of what's holy from God in the first place, then you've got a false sense of holiness. And if God says that it's holy and right to wipe out Jericho so that he can give it to the Israelites, he's sovereign. He is the God of the universe. He gets to do whatever he wants to do. He created it. It's his. He can do with it as he so sees fit. Paul puts it this way: shall the piece of clay say to the potter, I don't like the way you've made me? Right? We can question, we can be uncomfortable with it, but the bottom line is this is what God chose to do en route to giving his children the land of Canaan. It goes all the way back to a promise that he made to Abraham, and this was, he made it earlier, but the time frame I'm thinking about is after Abraham says to Lot, what part do you want? And Lot says, well, that green part over there by the cities of the plain, that really lush, beautiful area down there. That's what I want. Abraham says, you go there and I'll go over here. And then God comes to Abraham and he says, look to the north, look to the south, look to the east, look to the west. It's all yours. I'm going to give it all to you. I'm going to give it all to your descendants. Jericho is the first payment of that promise. And the people of Jericho mattered to each other, but they don't matter to the ultimate plan of what God's doing in the life of Israel. And it's harsh and it's cold and it seems callous to us, but it's nice that it does, because that means that God has given us a sense in our own lives of the importance of human life, and that we wouldn't make this decision because we don't own anything. We're the people. We're the creation. He gets to decide. But in our own hearts, we understand that among us, we couldn't make that decision. It's not ours to make. It's God's to make. And so, again, lots of different destructive judgments in the Old Testament. This one, again, has someone who gets saved. Right? Rahab gets saved. Did you notice that he goes across it 3 times in chapter 6? We're going to destroy everybody except Rahab. And then he tells the troops, destroy everybody except Rahab. And then toward the end of the chapter, it gives you the recap. So they destroyed everybody except Rahab. They took Rahab and all of her family, and where did they put her? Did you notice that? Outside the camp. So she wasn't immediately ushered into the middle of Israeli life. She was given a place over here and then later assimilated in to Israeli culture. Marries a man that ends up being in the lineage of Christ, right? She ends up being a woman in the lineage of the Messiah. So God has a way of inserting things that you would just never expect. In the worst possible situation, he draws somebody out of Jericho and puts them in a place that eventually brings them honor. Okay. You might find it interesting, I know I did, to just look at ancient maps of Jericho and the digs there, if anybody's into archaeology. There have been a few major digs going back to the late 1800s, 1930s. There was a major dig, and then Kathleen Kenyon in the 60s and 70s. There has been more interpretation of her findings lately, but not another large dig in the last 20 or 30 years. But anyway, if you're interested in archaeology, that is an interesting site just because of how far back it goes. Civilization had been in that place, cities had been in that place for thousands of years. And basically what happens, Israel comes in and destroys it. It's burned down. It's completely done. They move over. And so there was at the time of Jesus, there was a city of Jericho, but it wasn't in exactly the same location. It was kind of down the river valley a little bit from where this one was. So when you read about Jericho in the Old Testament and then see Jesus visiting Jericho in the New Testament, it's a slightly different demographic, just a little bit on down the road where they rebuilt it. Any questions or thoughts about any of that? Okay. If you need to respond to the invitation, we'd love to help you as we stand and sing.